The pressure in my chest began as a whisper that morning. A faint tightness I dismissed as I stood at the kitchen counter, chopping fresh dill. You learn to ignore the whispers when you're 65. You mistake them for the echoes of a life already lived, the normal aches and pains of a body that has carried more than its share. Outside, the Ohio autumn was putting on its final, brilliant show. The maple tree in the front yard was a blaze of orange and gold, and the air held a crisp, clean promise. Inside, my home was filled with the warm, comforting scent of simmering chicken. It was the smell of anticipation, the smell of love. I was making Mark's favorite soup, the one my own mother had taught me how to make. The recipe wasn't written down anywhere. It lived in my hands, in the muscle memory of chopping, stirring, and seasoning. He had loved this soup since he was a boy, calling it magic soup because it always made him feel better. Today, I wasn't trying to make him feel better. I was just trying to make him feel welcome. I had spent the entire morning preparing. The house was spotless, the good silverware was polished, and a vase of late-season chrysanthemums sat in the center of the dining room table. It had been weeks since I'd seen him, really seen him. Not just for a fleeting 5-minute drop-in on his way somewhere else. He and Katie were supposed to come for dinner. Proper dinner. A chance to sit and talk. To catch up. To feel like a family again. I hummed to myself as I stirred the pot. The gentle rhythm of familiar comfort. I imagined his face when he walked in. How his eyes would light up when he caught that first scent of home. He'd give me a quick, one-armed hug and say, "Smells amazing, Mom." Katie would follow behind him, her smile a little more reserved, a little more practiced. She'd compliment the flowers, or the tablecloth, something impersonal. It didn't matter. As long as Mark was here, it was enough. It had always been enough. My thoughts drifted back, as they often did, to his childhood. I saw him at 7, with a scraped knee, crying until I offered him a bowl of this very soup. I saw him at 17, all gangly limbs and teenage awkwardness, devouring 3 bowls after a football game. I saw him at 25, bringing Katie home to meet me for the first time, nervously watching her face as she took her first bite. She had smiled and said it was nice, but she never asked for the recipe. The whisper in my chest grew a little louder, a slight pressure, like a hand pressing gently against my sternum. I paused my stirring and took a slow breath. Probably just indigestion. I'd been rushing around all morning, too excited to eat a proper breakfast. I went to the sink and drank a small glass of water, watching a single, perfect red leaf drift down from the maple tree and land on the porch steps. The phone rang at 3 o'clock. I smiled as I wiped my hands on my apron and picked it up. It was probably him, calling to say they were leaving soon. "Hi, honey," I answered, my voice full of warmth. "Hey, Mom." His voice was casual, a little rushed. I could hear the familiar sounds of traffic in the background. He was in his car. "Are you on your way?" I asked, glancing at the clock. They'd be here just in time. "Ah, yeah, about that," he started, and my stomach tightened. I knew that tone. It was the preface to a disappointment. Something's come up. A few of Katie's friends decided to throw her a surprise birthday dinner tonight. "We're heading there now. I'm so sorry, but we're not going to be able to make it." The silence stretched. I could hear a car horn honk in the background of his call. "Oh," I finally said. The word was small, empty. "Her birthday isn't until next week, is it?" "I know, but you know how it is. It's a whole big thing. I can't really get out of it." He didn't sound apologetic. He sounded inconvenienced. I looked around my quiet, immaculate kitchen. I saw the pot of soup, simmering gently on the stove. I saw the 2 place settings at the dining room table. I saw the hours of my day, spent in happy, hopeful preparation, suddenly rendered meaningless. Of course, Dear, I said, my voice suddenly feeling thin and fragile. You can't miss her birthday party. That's fine. It was the lie I had told 1,000 times. It's fine. Don't worry about me. I understand. Great. Thanks for understanding. Mom, you're the best. I'll try and swing by sometime next week. Okay. Okay. Honey. I whispered. Love you. Bye. He hung up before I could say it back. I stood there for a long time, holding the silent phone. The scent of dill and chicken no longer felt comforting. Felt heavy. Suffocating. The house was too quiet. The pressure in my chest was no longer a whisper. It was a firm, insistent push. It wasn't just disappointment. It was a physical pain. A deep ache that spread from the center of my chest outwards, down my left arm. I walked slowly to the dining room and stared at the empty chairs. I had been so sure. So foolishly. Hopefully sure. I sat down at the table, alone, and listened to the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Each tick sounded like a word. Foolish, foolish, foolish. The afternoon light began to fade, and the soup on the stove grew cold. I didn't have the heart to turn it off. I just sat there as the shadows grew longer in my quiet house. The pain in my chest didn't go away. Settled in. A heavy, unwelcome guest. I told myself it was just a broken heart. I had felt it before. Many times. This was just a little sharper. A little deeper. By the time the sun had set completely, the ache had become a crushing weight. It was hard to breathe. I knew I should eat something, but the thought of food made me feel sick. Still, the soup was there. Mark's soup. Maybe a little bit would help. It always had before. I pushed myself up from the chair. My movements slow and stiff. I walked into the kitchen and ladled a small amount of the cooled soup into a bowl. My hand was trembling. As I turned from the stove, a wave of dizziness washed over me. The room tilted. The bowl, the one with the little blue flowers I'd bought at a flea market years ago, slipped from my grasp. It seemed to hang in the air for a moment, suspended in the dim light, before it crashed against the linoleum. The soup spilled. The bowl shattered. And I dropped with it. The cold of the tile was a violent shock against my cheek. My left arm wouldn't move. My legs were heavy. Useless things. Pinnock. Cold and sharp. Pierced through the fog of pain. I had to call for help. I had to call Mark. He would come. He had to come. My right hand, shaking uncontrollably, could still move. I dragged my body across the floor, my cheeks scraping against the gritty surface, towards the counter where I'd left my phone. Each inch was a monumental effort. My fingers finally brushed against it, fumbled, and then grasped it. I managed to unlock it with my thumb. His name was at the top of my recent calls. I tapped it. It rang. Each pulse was an eternity of hope and fear. Hey, Mom. His voice was bright, louder than before. I could hear music now. The cheerful clinking of glasses. A chorus of laughter. He was at the party. He was celebrating. Mark. I managed to say. My voice a strangled rasp I barely recognized. Help. Me. His tone shifted, laced with an unmistakable thread of irritation. Mom. I told you. I'm at Katie's party. It's really loud in here. Can I call you back tomorrow? Tears streamed from my eyes, mixing with the spilled soup on the floor. I tried to form the words. I'm on the floor. I can't get up. Something is wrong. But my mouth wouldn't work. Only a weak, gasping sound came out. Are you there? He asked, his voice sharp with impatience. Look, I have to go. They're cutting the cake. With the last ounce of my strength, I forced a single word through my lips, a word that was both a plea and a diagnosis. Ambulance. There was a short pause. I heard him say to someone near him, It's just my mom. Then, back to me, his voice flat and dismissive. Are you being serious? Yes, I whispered to the cold, unforgiving floor. Then came the final words. The words that shattered what was left of my heart far more completely than the ceramic bowl. Just call 911. Mom. That's what they're for. And he hung up. The screen went dark. The connection was severed. He left me in a roaring silence, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing, alone in the dark with the ghost of his favorite soup. The silence he left behind was a physical thing, pressed down on me, heavier than the pain in my chest. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, I just lay there, my face against the cool, sticky linoleum, the disconnect tone of the phone having faded into the vast emptiness of my kitchen. He was gone. The bright sounds of his life, the laughter, the music, the celebration had vanished, leaving me alone in the dark. I don't know if it was instinct or some last flicker of self-preservation, but my thumb moved on its own across the phone's screen. My vision was blurry with tears and the strange, shimmering haze that had descended over the room. I managed to dial the 3 numbers he had so casually suggested. 911. The voice on the other end was calm, professional. It was the voice of a stranger who was paid to care. And in that moment, it was the kindest sound in the world. I couldn't say much. Fallen. Chest. Can't. The words came out in broken pieces, like the shattered bowl beside me. But it was enough. The stranger understood. He told me to stay on the line. He told me help was coming. He didn't say he'd call me back tomorrow. The arrival of the paramedics was a blur of bright lights in the driveway, of heavy footsteps and urgent, low voices filling my silent home. They were efficient. Their questions direct. They didn't ask why I was alone. They didn't ask if anyone was coming. Their job was to fix the body, not the circumstances. Strong hands lifted me onto a stretcher, and as they wheeled me out, my head lolled to the side. I saw the dining room table, still perfectly set for 2. A ghostly monument to an evening that never happened. Then the front door closed, and the house was dark and empty once again. In the ambulance, and later in the emergency room, I was just a collection of symptoms. A name, an age, a set of vital signs on a humming monitor. The nurses moved with a practiced grace, their faces a mixture of focus and compassion. They attached wires to my chest, inserted N4 into my arm, and asked me the same questions over and over. Any allergies? Mrs. Decker. What medications are you taking? Can you tell me your date of birth? I answered them all in a voice that felt detached, as if it belonged to someone else. There was a space on the intake form for an emergency contact. I watched the nurse's pen hover over it. Is there anyone we should call for you? She asked gently. I thought of his name. Mark. I thought of his voice. Light and distracted. They're cutting the cake. The image was so vivid. So cruel. Him. Surrounded by friends. Smiling as Katie blew out her candles. While I was here. Under the merciless fluorescent lights. With strangers trying to save my life. No. I said. And the word felt both incredibly heavy and strangely freeing. There's no one. She didn't question it. She just made a small note on the form and moved on. To her. I was just another elderly patient who had outlived her connections. She couldn't know that my only connection had just severed the line himself. They admitted me to the cardiac unit. My room was sterile and beige, with a window that looked out onto a brick wall. A different nurse, a kind woman named Sarah with warm eyes and a soft voice, helped me get settled. She fluffed my pillows and made sure the call button was within reach. Is there someone we should notify that you're here? She asked, her tone gentle, as if she already knew the answer. A son, perhaps? A daughter? I shook my head, the movement small and tight. I couldn't bring myself to speak the truth aloud. My son left me on the floor. Sounded too dramatic, too pitiful. Instead, I just said, it's just me. All right then. she said with a comforting smile, patting my hand. Well, you've got us tonight. You're not alone here. But I was. The kindness of strangers was a balm, but it couldn't fill the vast, echoing space that had opened up inside of me. Once Sarah left, the reality of the situation crashed down. It wasn't just the fear of the heart episode, the terrifying fragility of my own body. It was the crushing weight of that phone call. I lay in the stiff, scratchy sheets and replayed it in my mind, each word a fresh wound. It wasn't just what he had said. It was how he had said it. The casual dismissal, the audible sigh of irritation, the complete and utter absence of concern. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't ask if I was hurt. He didn't even stay on the line long enough to hear me breathe. He heard the word ambulance and treated it not as a crisis, but as a task to be delegated. Just call 911. That's what they're for. He had outsourced his responsibility as a son to a government service. My mind, a traitorous archive, began to pull up memories, holding them up against the harsh light of the present. I saw myself at 30, leaving a frantic work meeting because the school nurse called to say Mark had a fever. I saw myself at 42, driving 3 hours in a snowstorm to his college dorm because he'd called, panicked about a final exam. I saw myself at 58, sitting in a sterile hospital room much like this one, holding his hand for 12 straight hours after a minor surgery, refusing to leave his side until he was awake and lucid. I had never delegated my role as a mother. I had never said, I'm busy. I had never said, can this wait? My life had been a series of dropped plans, canceled appointments, and set-aside needs, all in service of him. I had been his emergency contact, his safety net, his soft place to land. And when my own emergency came, my own moment of desperate need, I had landed hard, on a cold kitchen floor, alone. The anger began to burn then, a slow, steady heat that thawed the frozen shock. It wasn't a loud, explosive rage. It was a quiet, profound fury that settled deep in my bones. He hadn't just forgotten me. He hadn't just been busy. He had made a choice. In the moment that mattered most. He had weighed my life against a piece of birthday cake. And the cake had won. A doctor came in. A young man with a tired but kind face. He explained what had happened. Atrial fibrillation. A stress-induced cardiac event. My heart had been shocked back into a regular rhythm in the ER. We'll keep you for a couple of days for observation, he explained. The most important thing now is to rest and avoid any significant stressors. I almost laughed. My entire life had been one long, significant stressor. And the primary source of it was currently laughing over a glass of champagne somewhere across town. When the doctor left, I lay in the semi-darkness, listening to the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor beside my bed. Beep, beep, beep. Steady. Electronic proof that I was still alive. No thanks to my son. Each beep felt like a turning point. A decision was forming in my mind, solidifying from the molten grief and anger. It was a decision I should have made years ago. I pressed the call button. When Sarah's kind face appeared in the doorway, I looked at her. My voice clear and stronger than it had been all day. I've changed my mind, I said. There is something you can do for me. She walked over to the bed, her expression open and waiting. My intake form, I said. My gaze steady. The space for the emergency contact. Yes? I need you to go back and look at it. My son's name is probably listed in my old file. Mark Decker. If it is, I want you to remove it. Permanently. And I want a note placed in my chart. Under no circumstances is he to be given any information about my condition. And he is not to be allowed in this room. Sarah didn't look surprised. She looked understanding, as if she had heard this request before from other women in other beds who had finally reached their limit. She simply nodded. Of course, Mrs. Decker. She said softly, "I'll take care of it right now." As she left, pulling the door quietly shut behind her, I turned my head to face the dark window. I couldn't see my reflection, but I felt like I was seeing myself for the first time. I was not just a mother. I was not just a caregiver. I was not just an emergency contact. I was Eleanor Decker. And I was done. I was done waiting for the phone to ring. I was done setting a place for someone who would never show up. I was done being the second choice. The door to this room was now closed to him. And soon, every other door would be, too. It didn't happen with a roar of thunder or a dramatic, tear-filled speech. My revolution began in silence. A quiet Tuesday morning, with soft sunlight pressing through the blinds, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I had been discharged from the hospital the day before. A taxi brought me home. The driver, a kind man with a weathered face, helped me carry my small overnight bag up the 3 steps to the porch. I thanked him, unlocked the door, and stepped into my own house as if I were a guest entering for the first time. Everything was exactly as I had left it. The broken bowl was still and scattered. Sharp-edged pieces on the kitchen floor. A dried, pale puddle of soup was crusted beneath the table. I stood in the doorway and stared at it for a long time. I didn't feel shock or even a fresh wave of sadness. I felt a sense of stark recognition. That mess on the floor. It was a perfect mirror. It was the story of the last 35 years. All the years of cleaning up after others. After him. That's how it always was. He made the mess. Emotional or otherwise. I cleaned it up. Without thanks. Without pause. Without question. Not anymore. I didn't call a cleaning service. I didn't even sigh. I walked to the closet, took out a dustpan and a brush, and knelt down. The linoleum was cold against my knees. Slowly, deliberately, I swept the shattered pieces of my life into the pan. Each piece was a memory, a broken promise, a silent disappointment. When the last shard was gone, I stood up, my back straight, and wiped the floor clean with a damp cloth until no trace of the soup or the sorrow remained. Then I washed my hands, put the kettle on for tea, and opened my laptop at the kitchen table. The list I had written on that flimsy piece of hospital paper now sat beside me. It looked less like a list of chores and more like a declaration of independence. I read it again. 1. Call lawyer. Change will. 2. Stop all automatic payments. Block access to joint savings. 3. Retrieve spare key. My revenge, I decided, would not be loud. It would be quiet. It would be administrative. It would be the methodical untangling of a life that had become hopelessly knotted with someone else's. It wasn't fueled by a fiery rage, but by something steadier, colder. It was the simple, profound decision to stop offering pieces of myself to people who only noticed I existed when a piece they needed went missing. I made the first call. The lawyer, Mr. Harris, answered on the second ring, his voice professionally cheerful. Eleanor, good to hear from you. I heard you had a bit of a scare. Are you feeling better? Much better. Thank you, I said, and I was surprised by how true that felt. I need to make some immediate changes to my will and power of attorney. Of course, he said. We can schedule an appointment for next week. No, I interrupted, my voice calm and firm. I want to do it now. I need to remove a name, Mark Decker, from everything. Effective immediately. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the unspoken question hanging in the air. But Mr. Harris was a professional. He didn't ask for a story. He just accepted the instruction. I understand, he said, his tone shifting to one of pure efficiency. I'll draft the necessary documents and have a courier bring them over for your signature this afternoon. The call was over in less than 5 minutes. One major knot. Untangled. Next, I logged into my banking app. For years, A small portion of my pension had been automatically transferred to Mark's account on the 1st of every month. It started when he was in college. A little something for books and expenses. It never stopped. He'd never asked me to stop it. And I had never thought to offer. I found the recurring payment and clicked cancel. A small box popped up. Are you sure? I clicked yes. It was a surprisingly definitive feeling. I moved to the joint savings account. The one I had set up as an emergency fund that had only ever been used for his emergencies: a car repair, a deposit on an apartment, a down payment for a vacation. I transferred the entire balance to my personal checking account and then closed the joint account permanently. His name vanished from my screen. Each click felt like releasing another link in a long, heavy chain. The last item on the list was the key. I walked to the small dish by the front door where I kept spares. There it was. The key to my house. Attached to a tacky plastic keychain from an apartment he and Katie had moved out of 3 years ago. He hadn't even bothered to update it. Just assumed this one would always work. That this door would always be open to him. I took the key, dropped it into a small padded envelope, and sealed it. I wrote his name and address on the front. No note. No explanation. Just a label. I left it by the door for the mailman to pick up. A return to sender. I sat back down at the table with my cup of tea. The steam rose in the quiet air. The taste of chamomile was warm and plain. For the first time, the silence in my house didn't feel heavy with loneliness. It felt clean. Felt mine. Then came the knock. I didn't flinch. I knew it would come eventually. He was always a day late to everything that mattered. I stood up, walked to the front window, and peeked through a gap in the curtains. There he was. Mark. Holding a large bouquet of white lilies. A flower I've always found funereal. Forced. Apologetic smile was plastered on his face. The smile he practiced for clients. Not the one he saved for family. He knocked again. A little louder this time. I walked to the door and opened it, but only a few inches. Just enough to see him. I kept the chain on. Mom, he said. The smile faltering slightly when he saw the chain. I came as soon as I could. Katie's party. Well, you know how it is. It went late. I couldn't just leave. I didn't speak. I just looked at him. He kept going, filling the silence I was offering. I brought you your favorite. White lilies. I remembered you liked those. He tried to hand them to me through the gap. I didn't take them. He hesitated, the bouquet hovering awkwardly between us. You look okay, he said, his eyes scanning my face. Better. I was so worried. Why didn't you text me to let me know you were all right? I almost laughed. A bitter, ugly sound. He had hung up on me while I was on the floor. My heart failing. He had told me to call 911 because that's what they were for. And now? He wanted a text. He wanted reassurance that his actions had not had fatal consequences. I'm not taking visitors today, Mark, I said, my voice even and cool. He blinked, confusion clouding his face. What? Mom? I came all the way over here. I bought you flowers. As if the transaction of driving and purchasing absolved him of everything. I didn't ask you to. I said simply. His confusion curdled into annoyance. It was a familiar pattern. When his charm didn't work, frustration was always next. You're being dramatic. He sighed. That word. Dramatic. It's what he always called me when I had needs that inconvenienced him. When I asked him to call more often. Dramatic. When I asked for help moving a heavy bookshelf. Dramatic. When I told him that a comment Katie had made at Thanksgiving had hurt my feelings. Mom, don't be so dramatic. It was his word for dismissing me. No, I said, my gaze unwavering. I'm being clear. He took a step back, finally understanding that the script had changed. So what? You're just shutting me out now? After everything? I nodded slowly. For now, I said. Until I have reason to believe that I matter more to you than your own convenience. His mouth opened, then closed. He looked utterly lost. Is this because I missed dinner? He asked, his voice full of disbelief. Because of Katie's birthday? That's all he saw. A scheduling conflict. A simple misstep. He couldn't see the pattern. The years. The deep, aching pain of it all. He thought this was about one night. It was never about just one night. It was about every night. I looked at him standing on my porch, holding his drooping peace offering. His expression faltering. I could have yelled. I could have screamed. I could have listed every single disappointment. Every time he had left me waiting. Every promise he had broken. But I chose silence. Not to punish him, but to protect myself. There was nothing left to say. He held the flowers out one last time. A desperate, futile gesture. I didn't reach for them. He let his arm fall, then awkwardly placed the bouquet on the doormat. Strange. Sad offering at a door that would no longer open for him. He turned and walked away without another word. I closed the door, slid the deadbolt into place, and leaned against the solid wood. The clean, quiet house was my fortress now, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt completely and utterly safe. The flowers sat on the doormat for the rest of the day, a wilting monument to his failed apology. I watched them through the peephole as the afternoon sun made their white petals curl and brown at the edges. By evening, I opened the door just enough to slide the bouquet into the outdoor trash can. I didn't want the scent of them in my house. The house was quiet, but it was no longer a peaceful quiet. It was the tense, waiting silence that comes after a storm has passed but before you know the full extent of the damage. Every room held a memory, and now, some of them stung more than others. The armchair where he used to sit while I cooked. The hallway wall with the pencil marks tracking his height from a little boy to a man who towered over me. The photos on the mantelpiece of a smiling, happy family that felt like it belonged to someone else. 3 days passed. He hadn't called again. I hadn't expected him to. That was Mark's way of handling discomfort. He avoided it. He let it drift away like dust, assuming that, eventually, someone else would clean it up. That someone had always been me. I had always been the one to call, to smooth things over, to pretend a hurt hadn't happened for the sake of peace. But the peace had always been his, never mine. My silence was a new language, and it was one he clearly didn't understand. On the 4th morning, the doorbell rang. Not once, but 3 sharp, insistent presses in a row. I stood in the hallway, my heart beating a steady, calm rhythm this time. I didn't rush. I didn't panic. I just walked to the door and looked through the peephole. It was Katie. She was dressed in expensive-looking athletic wear, her blonde hair pulled back in a perfect ponytail. She looked like she had just come from a yoga class, but her posture was rigid. Her arms crossed tightly over her chest. I took a deep breath and opened the door, leaving the chain on again. "Hi, Eleanor," she said, attempting a bright, friendly smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Can we talk for a minute?" I didn't say no, but I didn't move to unlatch the chain either. I just waited. She took my silence as an invitation and stepped forward, speaking through the narrow gap. "Look, I think this has gone on long enough," she said, her voice losing its fabricated warmth and taking on a sharper, more businesslike edge. "Mark's been a complete wreck." A wreck. I thought about lying alone on my kitchen floor, unable to move. I thought about dialing his number with shaking fingers, my only hope in the world. I thought about his voice, light and distracted, and the sentence he chose to say. "I'll call you back tomorrow." "He feels just awful about what happened," she went on, her words quick and rehearsed. "He just didn't understand how serious it was. You know how he gets." He was distracted by the party. I said nothing. My silence was a wall, And I could see her becoming frustrated as her words bounced off it. Her tone shifted again. This time to one of condescending reason. Families fight. Eleanor. It happens. But you don't just cut people off over one bad moment. It's not healthy. One bad moment. I remembered every favor I had ever done for her. Every bill of theirs I had covered when they were short on cash. Every weekend I had babysat their dog so they could go on vacations I couldn't afford. I remembered the time she had unwrapped the hand-knitted blanket I made for her baby shower and whispered to her friend, loud enough for me to hear, "We'll have to replace this with something more modern." And Mark, standing beside her, had just nodded. I remembered cooking them a special dinner and her saying, with a little laugh, "Oh, we don't really do homey food anymore. Do we, Mark?" I remembered him laughing weakly when I told him I felt lonely sometimes, saying, "Mom, everyone gets lonely." I remembered them inviting me to Thanksgiving at her parents' house and then Mark asking me, on the side, not to talk too much, so I wouldn't overwhelm her family with my stories. I remembered how many times I had swallowed my words, my feelings, my very self, just to keep the fragile peace. "Are you finished?" I asked her. My voice was quiet, but it cut through her monologue like a knife. She blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me?" "You came here to deliver a speech," I said, looking directly into her eyes. "You came here to defend him and to manage me. You didn't come here to listen. I've done enough listening for a lifetime." She opened her mouth to say something else, something undoubtedly sharp and indignant, but I didn't give her the chance. I closed the door. Slowly. Without force. Without anger. There was just the soft click of the latch. And then the final, solid thud of the deadbolt sliding home. And that silence again. But this time, it felt powerful. This time, it was mine. That afternoon, the real campaign began. The calls started. First Mark. Then Katie. Then Mark again. I didn't answer. The voicemails began to stack up. A pathetic and infuriating collection of apologies mixed with excuses. Of regret laced with blame. "Mom, this is completely unfair. You're blowing this whole thing out of proportion." "Eleanor, this is Katie. I just want you to know that you've made Mark feel terrible. He's always done his best for you. And this is how you treat him." "Mom, it's me again. Katie's crying now because of this. Her mother called and said she thinks you're acting unstable. She says this feels like emotional blackmail." Emotional blackmail. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. They, who had held my love for him hostage for years, demanding my constant service and sacrifice in exchange for a few scraps of their attention, were accusing me of blackmail. The next day, I received a long, angry voicemail from Katie herself. "You have humiliated Mark," she snapped, her voice stripped of all pretense. "He's been anxious for days. He can't even focus at work. We have always supported you. And this is how you repay us? You could have called me if you were in trouble. But no. You'd rather play the victim and punish us like this." She kept going, her voice rising with every word, saying I had embarrassed them, that the neighbors were probably wondering why their car wasn't in my driveway anymore. "I don't care how sick you were," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "This is not how families are supposed to treat each other." That was the moment I blocked her number. Day 5. The messages from Mark turned sharper, angrier, more desperate. "If you keep this up, don't expect us to come around anymore. You're the one ruining this family, not me. I can't believe you're doing this over one stupid phone call. One mistake." They sent text messages filled with guilt trips, each one a tiny poison dart. "Dad would have been so ashamed of how you're acting. You've made Katie cry every single night this week. Is that what you want? Do you really want to die alone, Mom?" The question was meant to be a threat, But it felt like a diagnosis of my life up to that point. I had been alone for years. I had been alone while sitting in a room full of his in-laws. I had been alone while planning holiday dinners no one seemed to truly appreciate. I had been alone on my birthday when he called for 5 minutes from his car. And I had been truly, terrifyingly alone on my kitchen floor. Their presence had not cured my loneliness. It had been the very cause of it. But through all the messages, all the accusations and the blame, there was one sentence that was always missing. 3 simple words they never said. I am sorry. They never said. I'm sorry I didn't come. They never said. I'm sorry I left you. They never said. I'm sorry I failed you. That was the sentence that was missing every single time. And its absence was louder than all of their angry words combined. On the 5th day, a new tactic emerged. An email arrived in my inbox. The subject line, written in bold, capital letters, read Urgent Family Matter. It was from Mark. I opened it with a strange sense of detachment, as if I were reading about a family I barely knew. The email was long, rambling, and meticulously structured to sound reasonable, like a business proposal for my surrender. He wrote that he and Katie couldn't understand my behavior, that I was creating unnecessary conflict and destroying the family's equilibrium. He said that Katie was deeply hurt, that his coworkers had noticed he wasn't himself, that he missed our talks. What talks? I thought. He missed the talks where I listened and he spoke. Then came the final paragraph, the carefully worded ultimatum. If you don't stop this silent treatment and agree to family counseling with us, I don't know if we can continue to have a relationship with you. We have to protect our own mental health. I closed the laptop. He didn't miss me. He missed the version of me that served him. The one that answered on the first ring. That solved his problems. That absorbed his anxieties and never asked for anything in return. They didn't understand my actions because they had never taken a single moment to try and understand me as a person. And suddenly, with a clarity that was as painful as it was liberating, I realized something. I wasn't just dealing with a bad week or a single, terrible mistake. I had spent years, decades even, living in a relational house where my value was based entirely on my function. I was the foundation they took for granted, the walls that kept them comfortable, the roof that sheltered them from inconvenience. I was the one they called when the refrigerator broke in their first apartment. I was the one they called when their toddler was sick, and they had a non-refundable weekend trip planned. I was the one they called when money ran low just before payday. I was the backup plan, the last resort, the default. And when the foundation, finally developed a crack, when I finally needed something, really needed it, I got a party. I got laughter in the background. Just call 911. The 6th day, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I went for a walk with no destination in mind. Not to the grocery store. Not to the post office. Just a walk. The air was crisp, and the wind rustled the remaining leaves on the trees, a sound like gentle applause. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful. I saw my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Gable, a widow like me, tending to her rose bushes, preparing them for the first frost. She looked up as I approached, her gloved hands resting on her hips, and offered a warm, genuine smile. Her face was a roadmap of a life fully lived, etched with lines of laughter and sorrow. Eleanor, she said, her voice raspy but kind. It's good to see you out and about. I heard you were in the hospital for a couple of days. I hope everything is all right. News traveled fast in our small suburban town. I'm much better now. Thank you, Martha, I said. She looked at me, her gaze sharp and perceptive, as if she could see right through the polite facade to the turmoil underneath. You look different, she said. Not unkindly. Peaceful. I didn't know what to say, so I just gave a small shrug. She reached out and patted my arm, her touch surprisingly firm. You know, she said, lowering her voice slightly. You're one of the kindest people on this street. Everyone says so. You spend your whole life giving. She paused, then added the words that I didn't know I needed to hear. But some people don't deserve your loyalty, dear. It's okay to finally walk away from a place that's been taking from you for too long. Sometimes the quietest decision is the most powerful one. And that was when it hit me. I had been waiting for permission from someone, anyone, to stop carrying the weight of people who would not lift a single finger to help me in return. I had been waiting for Mark to see my pain, for Katie to show an ounce of compassion, for someone to validate my decision. But I didn't need their permission. The only permission I needed was my own. And in the knowing eyes of my neighbor, I found the confirmation I had been searching for. I thanked her, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name, and continued my walk. When I got home, there was one last voicemail waiting for me. I listened to it standing in the hallway, my coat still on. It was Mark's voice. Quiet, tired, but no less passive. I miss you, Mom, he said. And for a fleeting second, my heart ached. But if you're going to keep shutting us out like this, I don't know what else I can do. There it was again. What he could do, not what he should have done. His sorrow was not for my pain, but for his own inconvenience, for the disruption of his comfortable life. So I deleted the message. Then I deleted all the others, one by one, without listening to them again. Then I sat in my living room, in the big armchair by the window, my hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, and I breathed. I breathed in the silence. I breathed in the solitude. I breathed in the clean, empty space I had created. Not because the fight was over, but because I had finally stopped hoping it would get better. I had accepted that it wouldn't. I had let go. And in that empty, echoing hall of a house, I didn't feel alone. For the first time, I felt free. And then I did something I didn't expect. Something I hadn't done in what felt like a lifetime. I smiled. It wasn't a big, happy smile. It was a small, quiet, knowing smile. And it was all for me. The first thing I did the next morning was call a locksmith. Not out of spite, and not because I was afraid Mark would try to force his way in. I called him because I had finally and completely accepted that I didn't want anyone walking into my home, my life, unless they respected what that home meant. For too long, I had allowed them to come and go as they pleased, treating my personal space as if it were a public utility, a place to drop into whenever it was convenient for them. They didn't knock. They didn't ask. They assumed. And for too long, I had allowed it. Until now. The locksmith was a young man with kind eyes who didn't ask any questions. As he efficiently drilled out the old locks and fitted the new, gleaming brass ones, I stood by the door and watched. The sound of the drill was loud, decisive. It felt like a surgical procedure, removing something that had been a part of the house for years, but had become unhealthy. When he was finished, he handed me a set of new keys. They felt cool and solid in my palm. They felt like safety. All set, ma'am, he said, packing up his tools. I thanked him and paid him, adding a generous tip. After he left, I stood in my foyer, holding the new keys. I looked at the pile of old, unused ones I had gathered from the kitchen drawer spares I had handed out over the years to make their lives easier. I put them all in a plastic bag, walked them out to the trash can, and dropped them in with a satisfying thud. That afternoon, the letters started. Not handwritten ones. That would have required too much effort. They were typed, cold, formal, and slipped into my mailbox. The first one was from Katie. Single, printed page, folded neatly, likely meant to look calm and reasonable. But the words were anything but. We are deeply disappointed by your recent actions. It read, it's important for our children to understand the values of compassion and forgiveness. And your current choices are sending them the wrong message. Mark has been deeply hurt by your refusal to communicate. We hope that, in time, you will reflect on the damage you are causing and reconsider your position. Not one word asking how I was feeling. Not a single phrase of apology. Only accusations wrapped in the polite, passive-aggressive language of therapy speak. They were framing my self-preservation as an act of aggression against them. Then came the texts again. This time from blocked numbers and unfamiliar names. Coordinated attack. This is Sarah, your granddaughter's godmother. Mark told me what's going on. Please don't do this to him. You're tearing this family apart. Eleanor. It's Brenda from Katie's book club. Katie is so distraught. We're all very worried about her. Whatever the problem is, surely it can be resolved. They wanted me to feel shame. They wanted to rally a jury of their peers and publicly convict me of being a bad mother. They wanted to pull me back into the same toxic circle of guilt and obligation I had just managed to step out of. And for a moment, fleeting, shaky moment, I questioned myself. Was I being too harsh? Was I punishing them unfairly? Was I, as they claimed, the one destroying everything? But then I remembered. I let the memory wash over me, not as a vague feeling, but as a crystal-clear image. I remembered every word. I remembered the sound of laughter over the phone while I lay helpless on my kitchen floor. I remembered every moment they had justified their own comfort over my crisis. I remembered every empty excuse that followed. I remembered the profound, absolute silence I was met with when I needed someone. Just one person. The most. I remembered calling his name and hearing, in reply, "Can I call you back tomorrow?" That wasn't a misunderstanding. That wasn't a mistake. That was a choice. A clear and unambiguous choice. And I had finally made mine. A week after the locks were changed, I got a call from the hospital's administrative office. It was a polite young woman with a crisp, professional voice. "Good morning, Mrs. Decker. I'm just calling to confirm your follow-up cardiology appointment for next Tuesday at 10 a.m. Yes, that's correct, I said. Excellent. She continued. And we just need to verify your transportation arrangements. Will your son, Mark, be bringing you, as he usually does? The question was routine, a simple checkbox on her screen. But for me, it was a lightning strike, as he usually does. The phrase hung in the air, a testament to a life of service I no longer lived. Yet, he used to bring me. He would sigh about taking time off work, text on his phone the entire time in the waiting room, and complain about the traffic on the way home. His presence had been a favor, not a comfort, and I had always been expected to be grateful for the inconvenience. No, I said, my voice steady and clear. He will not. Oh, okay, the woman said, a slight hesitation in her voice. Do you have another ride? Or should I arrange for the hospital's volunteer transport service? The transport service would be wonderful. Thank you, I said. Of course. We'll have that booked for you. And one last thing. Just to update our records. We received a call this morning from a Mr. Mark Decker, identifying himself as your son, requesting the details of this appointment. Due to the note on your file, we did not release any information, but I wanted to make you aware of the call. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach, but my voice remained calm. Thank you for upholding my privacy. That note stands. He is not authorized to receive any of my medical information. Please ensure that is clear across all departments. Understood, Mrs. Decker, she replied, her tone now colored with a faint hint of something that sounded like respect. Is there anyone else you'd like to add as an approved contact? I paused, thinking for a moment. Who was my person? Who could I count on? The answer was both heartbreaking and empowering. Yes, I said. There is. And who would that be? Me, I said. Eleanor Decker. I am my own emergency contact now. After the call, I walked into the spare room at the end of the hall. It had always been Mark's room, even years after he'd moved out. When he married Katie, it became Mark and Katie's room. I always kept it tidy, the bed made with fresh sheets and extra pillows, just in case they ever decided to drop by and stay over unexpectedly. They never did. But the room was always ready. Silent, hopeful offering. I stood in the doorway and stared at it. The room was neat, impersonal, and full of ghosts. I saw a little boy with blonde hair building a fortress out of pillows. I saw a teenager with headphones on, ignoring my calls for dinner. I saw a young man and his wife, their luggage dropped on the floor, barely staying long enough to catch their breath before heading out to meet friends. This room wasn't a guest room. It was a museum of my own unmet expectations. I walked to the window, the one that looked out over Mrs. Gable's rose bushes, and pushed it open. Cool, fresh autumn air flooded the stale space. The lace curtains fluttered, dancing more freely than they had in years. I stayed there for a long time, just breathing. The next morning, I started boxing things up. I worked with a quiet, methodical energy. Everything that didn't feel like mine was placed carefully into a cardboard box. Photos of Mark and Katie from their wedding, where I looked like a smiling, slightly out-of-focus guest. Knickknacks they brought back from vacations and given to me as afterthoughts. His old high school yearbooks. The collection of baby books and childhood drawings they had never bothered to come and pick up. I labeled each box with a black marker mark. I didn't throw them away. That felt too angry, too final. But I didn't keep them close, either. I carried the boxes, one by one, down to the basement, and stacked them neatly against the far wall. Out of sight, out of mind. Then, the real work began. I started to fill the empty room with things that were mine. I went to the bookstore and bought a tall stack of novels I had always meant to read. I went to the local nursery and bought 3 houseplants, a vibrant fern and 2 flowering succulents, placing them on the windowsill where they could catch the morning light. I went down to the basement and retrieved a painting I'd done in a community art class years ago, a simple landscape of a lake at sunset. I'd once hidden it away after Katie commented that the colors clashed terribly with the furniture. I hung it on the main wall, right in the center. It didn't clash with anything now. I found a small, sturdy desk at a second-hand store and placed it under the window. I unearthed my old journals, the ones filled with half-finished thoughts and observations from a life that had been constantly interrupted. I bought a new pen. I cleared the surfaces. I made space. I turned the guest room, their room, into a writing room. Quiet place for me. For the first time in years, the physical space in my home was beginning to match the emotional space I was carving out in my own life. It was no longer a holding area for other people's needs and memories. It was becoming a reflection of me. About 2 weeks after the locks had been changed, after the phone calls and texts had finally trickled to a stop, I received a small, cream-colored card in the mail. There was no return address. My name was written on the front in elegant, unfamiliar handwriting. I opened it cautiously. The note inside was short. It wasn't signed. I saw you at the hospital that night. You were alone. I was sitting across from you in the waiting room while my husband was being seen. I didn't know what to say, but I recognized you from the neighborhood. You were the woman who brought my mother a blanket and a cup of tea last winter when her furnace broke. You sat with her for an hour until the repairman came. You told me then that no one should have to be cold and alone. I just wanted you to know that your kindness mattered to a stranger. I hope you are well. I read the note twice, my fingers tracing the elegant script. Then I folded it carefully and tucked it into the drawer of the new desk in my new room. There was nothing to reply to. No one to thank. It was just a simple, unvarnished truth, delivered from the universe when I needed it most. Sometimes, the people we pour our entire selves into aren't the ones who truly see us. But that doesn't mean we are invisible. Just means we've been watering the wrong gardens. All the love and care and kindness I had given so freely had not been wasted. It had just been directed at a place where it could not grow. The final message I ever received from Mark came a month later. It was a single, stark text message that appeared on my phone late one night. "I don't know who you are anymore." I read it once, and then I smiled, because for the first time in my life, I did. I knew exactly who I was. I was someone who knew her own worth. I was someone who had stopped begging to be loved in return. I was someone who no longer waited by the phone, by the door, or by the window. I was someone who was finally home. That night, I sat in my chair in my quiet room by the window, sipping my tea and listening to the sound of the wind outside. The house didn't feel empty. It felt full of peace, full of space, full of light, full of me, just me. And that was more than enough. The silence in the house evolved. First, it had been a raw, gaping emptiness, a void defined by the absence of phone calls I no longer expected and footsteps I no longer listened for. But slowly, day by day, it transformed. The emptiness began to fill up, not with noise, but with substance. It became a gentle, nurturing quiet, the kind of stillness that allows you to hear your own thoughts for the first time in years. My days took on a new rhythm, one that was dictated by my own wants rather than the anticipated needs of others. I woke with the sun, not with a jolt of anxiety about what I needed to do for someone else. I would make my tea and sit in my new writing room, the one that used to be a shrine to them, and I would watch the light change across the pages of my open journal. I started to write. Not grand stories, just small things. I wrote about the way the frost etched patterns on the window pane, about the taste of a perfectly ripe pear, about a memory from my own childhood that had been buried for decades under the weight of being Mark's mother. I was reintroducing myself to myself, one sentence at a time. I learned to be my own provider in small, significant ways. When the kitchen faucet started to drip, my first instinctive, deeply ingrained reflex was to call Mark. He was always good with those kinds of things. My hand even hovered over the phone before I stopped myself. "He is not your handyman." Clear, calm voice in my head reminded me. So, I went online. I watched 3 tutorial videos. I bought a small wrench and a $5 washer from the hardware store. And an hour later, with a sense of triumph that was far greater than the task deserved, I fixed the drip myself. I stood in the silent kitchen, listening to the beautiful sound of nothing, and felt a surge of pride that was pure and wholly my own. I reconnected with old friends, women from my teaching days who I had drifted away from, my social life having been slowly absorbed by Mark and Katie's. I met them for coffee, for walks in the park, for lunches that stretched for hours, filled with easy laughter and shared stories. They didn't talk about their children's latest promotions or their daughter-in-law's decorating choices. They talked about books, politics, travel, and the quiet joys and sorrows of their own lives. They asked me questions about myself, about my thoughts and my feelings, and they listened to the answers. I had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as a person, not just a role. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when the ghost of my old life would reappear, catching me off guard. One crisp Saturday afternoon, I was at the farmer's market, enjoying the vibrant chaos of it all, when I saw them. A young family, a mother, father, and a son about Mark's age, all laughing as they tried to pick out the perfect pumpkin. The son playfully put his arm around his mother's shoulder and squeezed. She leaned her head against his, her face beaming with a simple, uncomplicated love. A pang of grief, so sharp and sudden it almost stole my breath, shot through me. It was a vision of what I thought I had, of what I had lost. For a fleeting, painful moment, I questioned everything. Had I been too harsh? Too unforgiving? Was this quiet, solitary peace worth the price of that lost connection? The loneliness felt immense, a vast, Cold ocean threatening to pull me under. I bought my groceries with my head down. The joy of the day suddenly evaporated. I drove home, the silence in the car now feeling heavy and sad again. I walked into my house, and the quiet that had become my comfort now felt like a judgment. I sat in my armchair and let the sadness wash over me. I didn't fight it. I let myself feel the full weight of the loss, the death of the relationship I had poured my entire life into. But as I sat there, surrounded by the life I was building for myself, the thriving plants on the windowsill, the half-finished book on the table, the painting of the sunset on the wall, another feeling began to surface. It was a feeling of profound relief. I remembered the constant, low-grade anxiety of my old life, the feeling of always waiting for a call, waiting for a visit, waiting for a scrap of appreciation, the exhaustion of constantly managing his moods and Katie's criticisms, the gut-wrenching disappointment that came like clockwork. The peace I had now was real. It wasn't dependent on someone else's mood or schedule. It was solid. It was mine. The brief, happy scene at the market was just theta snapshot. I had no idea what that family's life was really like. But I knew, with absolute certainty, what my life with Mark had been like. And I knew I could not go back. The grief was the price of my freedom, and I was willing to pay it. I stood up, walked into my writing room, and picked up my pen. I didn't write about the sadness. I wrote about the strength it takes to sit with your own sorrow and not be consumed by it. I wrote about the quiet dignity of choosing yourself. By the time I finished, the sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow into the room. The pain had subsided, leaving behind not a scar, but a quiet strength. It was a reminder that healing wasn't a straight line. It was a path with its own shadows and light, and I was learning to navigate it, one steady step at a time. The house was quiet, and for the first time, even with the echo of sadness still in the air, I felt truly, unshakably at peace within its walls. Winter arrived, blanketing the quiet streets of Maple Creek in a soft, muffling layer of snow. The world outside grew still, and my world within became richer. The quiet routine I had established became a comforting ritual. My mornings were for writing, my afternoons for reading or long, bundled-up walks, and my evenings for quiet contemplation by the window, watching the snowflakes drift down under the glow of the streetlights. The house no longer felt like a place of solitude, felt like a sanctuary. One afternoon, a few weeks before Christmas, I was sorting through a box of old holiday decorations in the basement. I pulled out a string of tangled lights and a small, handmade ornament. It was a clumsy clay star, painted a garish shade of blue, with the name Mark scratched into it, dated 1993. I held the cold, heavy star in my palm, a relic from a lifetime ago. A wave of memory, softer and less painful now, washed over me. I remembered his small, paint-smeared hands as he proudly presented it to me. I remembered the pure, unconditional love that had once flowed so easily between us. I didn't feel anger anymore, just a gentle, distant sadness, the kind you feel for a story that has already ended. I didn't put the star on the tree I had bought for myself. I wrapped it carefully in tissue paper and placed it in the box labeled with his name, alongside the other artifacts of his childhood. It was a part of his story, not mine. My tree was decorated with simple glass baubles and white lights, ornaments that reflected my own quiet taste, not the memories of someone else. As I was heading back upstairs, my eyes fell upon another box tucked away in a corner, one I hadn't touched. It was filled with my old teaching materials. On a whim, I pulled it out. Inside, beneath dusty textbooks and lesson plans, was a thick binder full of letters and cards from former students, collected over 30 years of teaching. I spent the rest of the afternoon sitting by the fire, reading them. There were heartfelt thank you notes from parents, funny, misspelled cards from third graders, and long, thoughtful letters from high school students who had gone on to become doctors, artists, and engineers. They wrote about how a book I'd recommended had changed their perspective, how a word of encouragement had given them confidence, how my belief in them had made them believe in themselves. One letter, tucked near the back, stopped me. It was from a young woman whose family had moved to town in the middle of her senior year. She had been quiet, angry, and struggling to fit in. I had taken extra time with her, helping her with her college application essays. The letter was dated 5 years after her graduation. Dear Mrs. Decker. It read, I don't know if you'll remember me, but I've been meaning to write this letter for years. That last year of high school was the hardest of my life. I felt completely invisible. But you saw me. You didn't just teach me how to write a better sentence. You taught me that my story was worth telling. I'm a journalist now. I get to help other people tell their stories. I wanted to thank you. You didn't have to care. But you did. It made all the difference. Tears welled in my eyes. But they were not tears of sadness. I carefully placed the letter on the mantelpiece, next to a photo of my own parents. The two letters, the one from my former student and the one from Mark, sat in my mind, side by side. One was a testament to a life of service that demanded everything and gave nothing back. The other was a testament to a life of quiet, meaningful connection. One was from a son who couldn't recognize his own mother. The other was from a near stranger who felt seen by me after only a few months. The truth settled over me, gentle and final as the falling snow. My love had not been wasted. My care had not been worthless. It had simply been invested in the wrong place. For decades, I had poured all of my water, all of my light, all of my energy into a single, barren pot, hoping something beautiful would grow, while all around me, a garden I had barely noticed was blooming. The climax of my story was not a tearful reunion or a dramatic confrontation. It was this quiet moment of realization. My healing wasn't about him finally understanding what he had lost. It was about me finally understanding what I had not. I had not lost my capacity to love or to be loved. I had not lost my worth. I had only lost a deeply ingrained, painful habit of putting myself last. On Christmas Eve, I sat in my armchair, the house lit only by the soft glow of the tree. My phone, which had been silent for months, was on the table beside me. I didn't look at it. I was no longer waiting for anything. My home was filled not with the boisterous noise of a family gathering, but with the peaceful hum of contentment. I had found that you don't need to earn your place at the table. Sometimes, you need to build a new table, just for you. And if someone asks too much of you, if they demand your light but offer only shadow in return, you are allowed to walk away. You are allowed to choose the quiet warmth of your own company. I raised my teacup in a silent toast to the woman I had become, a woman who no longer died when love did. A woman who had learned, finally, how to be her own magic soup, her own soft place to land, her own emergency contact. A woman who was, alas, enough.